The doctrine of the Wehrmacht, meticulously built upon generations of Prussian military thought and tested fiercely during the Blitzkrieg, rested on a foundational belief that geography, immutable and dependable, was the steadfast ally of the prepared defender. Their strategy often leveraged natural barriers, the sheer face of a cliff, the impassable mire of a swamp, the depth of a river, the choked density of an old-growth forest, to dictate the pace and direction of the battle. German intelligence officers, highly trained in cartography and logistics, could confidently draw lines on a map and assure their commanders that armor could not, under any conceivable circumstances, cross that threshold. These zones of supposed safety became the anchors of defensive planning, the quiet havens from which counterattacks could be launched, and the predictable funnels into which advancing enemy forces could be trapped. Yet, the history of the European and Mediterranean theaters of World War II holds crucial, often understated moments where American engineering ingenuity, coupled with an almost reckless audacity in execution, shattered this geographical certainty. These were not routine armored breakthroughs achieved through brute force or overwhelming numbers on an expected route. These were logistical violations, acts of tactical shock where the American tank materialized precisely where the German High Command had determined it was physically impossible to be. The resulting psychological and strategic devastation often outweighed the immediate tactical gains, fundamentally demoralizing defenders who watched their safe zones evaporate into smoke and the relentless rumble of steel. We document 5 such decisive instances where the olive-drab hulks of American armor ignored the map, defied the terrain, and rewrote the rules of engagement. The harsh, unforgiving landscape of Italy provided the backdrop for the first monumental defiance of German geographical expectation. The fight up the peninsula was a brutal series of flanking maneuvers and frontal assaults against entrenched mountain positions, epitomized by the formidable defenses of the Gothic Line. The Germans had learned quickly to utilize the Apennine spine, treating the sheer slopes and high, narrow passes as impenetrable gates. Any heavy vehicle movement was expected to be confined strictly to the few major valleys or the coastal roads, all of which were sighted in, heavily mined, and protected by interlocking fields of fire from concrete pillboxes carved into the mountain rock. It was in the winter of 1944, under a low, oppressive canopy of gray Italian sky, that this certainty was first betrayed. A mechanized company, primarily equipped with M4 Shermans, the backbone of American armored power, was tasked not with storming a pass, but with bypassing one entirely. The terrain was a savage mix of sheer, icy crags, loose slate, and frozen scree. German estimates placed the impossibility factor at maximum. The slopes were steeper than any tank was rated to climb, and the subsurface ice ensured traction was non-existent. The solution lay in industrial archaeology. American engineers, working with local partisans and detailed survey data, rediscovered and reinforced ancient, largely forgotten logging paths. These paths, used decades prior to haul vast trunks of timber down the mountainside, were little more than widened game trails, switchbacking precariously along the contour lines. They were narrow, deeply rutted, and often covered in a glaze of treacherous verglass. The movement was agonizingly slow and tremendously loud. The crews stripped the Shermans of all non-essential gear, augmenting the tracks with purpose-built grousers and using heavy chains wrapped around the bogies. The sensory reality of this ascent was relentless. The heavy treads bit and scraped against the frozen shale with a sound like a giant tearing metal across rock, a constant grating noise that echoed strangely in the still, high mountain air, muffled slightly by the falling snow. Exhaust fumes, thick and white, hung like ghostly shrouds in the cold air, quickly condensing and freezing on the steel hulls. For hours, the column crawled upwards, each tank depending entirely on the skill of its driver to maintain balance against the lateral tilt. There was no room for error.
A slip meant a catastrophic, lethal tumble hundreds of feet down the slope. Winch cables were run hundreds of yards ahead, anchored to sturdy, centuries-old chestnut trees, providing the only reliable means of maneuvering around the tight, acute angles of the switchbacks.
The drivers fought the steering levers, their bodies drenched in sweat despite the biting cold that seeped into the steel cabin. Then, just before dawn, the lead Sherman crested the final ridge. The tank, angular and imposing, silhouetted momentarily against the fading winter starlight, appeared on the high flank of the German defensive position.
Below them, nestled in the valley, were the concrete bunkers and artillery batteries, aimed resolutely down the expected approach corridor. The shock was immediate and paralyzing.
The German forward observers, peering through their scopes, could not initially process the sight. They had been assured, multiple times, that their flank was protected by the unassailability of the geography. The apparition of those olive-drab hulls, heavy treads churning slowly on terrain fit only for mountain goats, sent immediate tremors through the entrenched positions. When the Shermans opened fire, delivering high explosive rounds directly onto the roofs of the German bunkers from an angle no defensive designer had anticipated, the tactical surprise transitioned instantly into outright panic. The fortified pass, deemed impregnable, was rendered useless in minutes, bypassed by a display of sheer mechanical endurance and tactical audacity that the Wehrmacht doctrine simply failed to encompass. The second profound violation of natural barriers occurred further north, deep within the dark, suffocating confines of the Hurtgen forest. This sector became infamous, rightly dubbed the Green Hell by American soldiers. It was a region of dense, second-growth pine, where the forest canopy was so thick that daylight rarely penetrated, creating a perpetual, damp twilight. The primary topographical challenge was the soil itself, a deep, sucking morass of mud and decaying organic matter, interspersed with a treacherous labyrinth of gnarled, tangled root systems. German defensive planning here was meticulous. They understood that the narrow forest tracks offered the only avenues for wheeled transport and tanks. Consequently, they concentrated their defense on these roads, seeding them heavily with mines and covering them with pre-sighted fire from mortars and well-camouflaged anti-tank guns. Intelligence reports assured German commanders that any attempt to move heavy armor off these roads and through the dense forest floor was logistically suicidal. The ground would simply swallow the vehicles, bogging them down into immobility, where they would be easy prey for infantry ambush and artillery. Yet, the American drive necessitated flanking the German strongpoints, which meant penetrating the very heart of the tangle. This maneuver called upon the specialized engineering attachments and the raw torque of the M4 medium tank. The objective was a calculated risk, to move an armored company not around a bog, but through what appeared to be an endless swamp of mud and roots, directly onto the flank of a presumed safe defensive artillery position situated deep within the woods. The scene was one of overwhelming sensory bombardment. The air was heavy, damp, and smelled strongly of pine needles, wet earth, and the acrid stench of diesel exhaust mingling with the burning smell of overheated track components. The tanks plunged into the morass, their powerful engines roaring defiantly, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the dense, silent forest, advertising their presence, but also suggesting an unstoppable, violent momentum. The tracks immediately churned the upper layer of mud into a thick, black slurry, which coated the suspension and hull. Drivers worked blind, relying on the constant guidance of spotters who walked alongside, navigating between the exposed, iron-hard root systems of ancient oaks and pines.
When a tank hit a pocket of truly deep mud, the movement would slow to a glacial crawl, the hull shuddering violently as the engines strained against the resistance, the tracks spinning momentarily, throwing thick clods of earth high above the turret.
It was a battle of physics.
The weight distribution of the Sherman was pushed to its limits, but the crew commanders demonstrated relentless determination. They learned to float the tanks by maintaining maximum forward speed where possible, forcing the heavy vehicle to plane across the worst sections. When a tank inevitably became mired, often sinking up to its belly plate, engineering recovery vehicles, designated specially for this operation, would immediately engage, winching the stricken tank forward inch by excruciating inch. The forest floor was not defeated by elegance, but by sheer, grinding persistence. When the tanks finally broke free from the worst of the mud, they began the approach phase, tearing through thick brush and low-hanging branches that slapped violently against the hull and turret. The noise was immense, but the very audacity of the maneuver was its protection. The German infantry and artillery crews, relying on the deep forest as their buffer, simply did not place anti-tank weapons on that flank. They heard the distant roaring, dismissed it as Allied operations on the known roads, or perhaps a stalled recovery effort. Then, from the impenetrable gloom of the underbrush, the Shermans materialized. They burst through the final line of tangled brush, mud-caked, branches sticking out like grotesque antennae, engines screaming, and fired immediately into the unprepared rear of the German battery positions. The tactical outcome was devastating. These were not prepared positions for a close-quarters tank fight. The German crews panicked, their safe haven having dissolved around them, replaced by the crushing reality of 30 tons of American steel appearing like a monster from the deep earth. Moving west to the rapid advance across France in the summer and autumn of 1944, the element of surprise shifted from vertical defiance, the mountains, and subterranean persistence, the mud, to a mastery of the aqueous environment. Rivers and major waterways were the classic last lines of defense for the retreating Wehrmacht, but even the smaller, shallow tributaries and drainage canals were pressed into service. German intelligence knew the limitations of standard armor. Tanks required bridges or highly prepared fording points. Consequently, they established secondary artillery batteries and mobile infantry reserves, positioned just beyond these minor waterways, expecting an hour or two of warning, as American engineers constructed pontoon bridges or cleared ford sites. One documented action involved the highly effective, though complex, application of modified amphibious tanks. While the famous duplex drive DD Sherman was primarily designed for beach landings, modified versions and light amphibious vehicles like the M29 Weasel or modified Stewards were utilized with brilliant, shocking effect in the interior of France, not to cross a deep river, but to use a shallow riverbed itself as a concealed avenue of advance. The operation unfolded on a misty morning. The river in question was wide but deceptively shallow, its banks heavily shrouded by a damp, thick mist that clung low to the churning surface of the water. The German anti-tank defenses were positioned hundreds of yards back from the riverbank, confident that the water itself formed a secure, observable perimeter. The American tanks entered the river quietly, utilizing low revs and submerged drive mechanisms. They proceeded upstream against the gentle current, hugging the middle of the shallow channel. The sensory experience was alien for armor crewmen. The constant sound of the river, the gentle lapping against the hull, the churning of the submerged tracks disturbing the muddy silt, masked the engine noise. The hulls were constantly dripping, slimy with weeds and river debris, their surfaces reflecting the pale, diffused light filtered through the mist. The crews maintained strict radio silence, relying on hand signals passed from tank to tank above the swirling, cold water. The objective was a key German 150mm artillery battery that had been pounding the Allied forward elements for 48 hours. The location was secure because the river, bending sharply to the east at that point, created a blind spot, a place where the Germans focused solely on the land approaches. Suddenly, with barely a splash and muffled only by the pervasive mist, the modified tanks transitioned from the aqueous environment to the hard earth. They surfaced rapidly, the angular hulls emerging from the water directly behind the enemy artillery position. Water cascaded off the armor plating as the drivers gunned the engines, the sound instantly transforming from a quiet gurgle to a metallic roar. The change in acoustic character was immediate and terrifying. The German artillery crews were focused downrange, eyes fixed on their spotters and the incoming counter-battery fire from the west. They had no forward security detail in the rear, protected as they were by the river. When the first high-explosive round detonated amongst the gun crews, followed instantly by the rapid, heavy chatter of coaxially mounted .50 caliber machine guns, the surprise was total. The shock was profoundly tactical. The German battery, capable of inflicting enormous damage frontally, was entirely exposed to a rear assault from a direction deemed impossible. The unexpected appearance of armor emerging, dripping wet and aggressive from the mist-shrouded, churning water rendered the crews instantly ineffective. This maneuver was a definitive statement that even liquid barriers were now mere highways for the relentless American advance, redefining the concept of a flank attack. The fourth instance took the war into the most claustrophobic and destructive environment, the dense, rubble-strewn maze of a besieged city, likely during the brutal street fighting that characterized battles like Aachen or Manila. Urban warfare imposes the most severe constraints on armor. Tanks are generally confined to broad, cleared avenues, where their guns have clear fields of fire. Alleyways, narrow streets choked with debris, and especially subterranean structures are considered absolute no-go zones, too restrictive, too prone to collapse, and perfect traps for infantry armed with explosive charges or Panzerfausts. The German defenders within the besieged city relied heavily on this certainty. They established command posts and field hospitals in the internal blocks, knowing that the dense, pulverized concrete and the deep cellars of the shattered buildings protected them from everything except the most direct aerial bombing. The network of above-ground rubble was a predictable barrier. The American objective was audacious: to use the city's ruined infrastructure not as a barrier, but as a temporary subterranean avenue for a column of light armor. This required selecting smaller, highly maneuverable tanks, M5 Stuarts or the later M24 Chaffies, and coordinating directly with combat engineer teams carrying specialized breaching charges. The chosen route involved a terrifying combination of municipal infrastructure. First, large-diameter storm drains and older, cleared sewage tunnels that were just wide enough for the light armor were utilized. Then, where the tunnels failed or were too unstable, the engineers meticulously breached and connected the cellars and collapsed ground floors of adjoining structures, creating a continuous, dusty path, shielded entirely from street-level observation. The sensory reality of this movement was suffocating. The air below ground was thick, particulate, and choking, a mixture of pulverized concrete dust, lime, sewage residue, and the stench of ruptured gas and water pipes. Visibility was minimal, often requiring the use of powerful searchlights mounted temporarily on the hulls. The sound of the tank tracks changed dramatically. Instead of the roar on asphalt, there was a deafening, echoing grind as the heavy metal plates scraped and chewed through broken brick, fractured pavement, and tangled rebar. Every movement amplified the noise in the confined space, making communication nearly impossible, except through frantic hand signals and helmet microphones. The passage was fraught with risk. The tank commanders had to navigate collapsed ceilings, protruding utility pipes that threatened to shear off periscopes, and sections where the structure was barely held together. The slightest miscalculation could bury the entire vehicle and crew. The final emergence was planned for the rear courtyard of a major German strongpoint, a building assumed to be secured by multiple internal blocks and inaccessible to armor. The engineers set a shaped charge against a thick cellar wall, and the resulting blast was a muted, localized thump. Through the pulverized hole, the lead Stuart burst forth, its small stature belying its shocking, destructive power. Covered in the white-gray dust of pulverized concrete, Its muzzle flash was a blinding, instantaneous explosion of light in the dim, dusty interior courtyard.
The appearance of even one tank in a supposedly secure rear area caused instantaneous systemic collapse of the German defense. Personnel who had survived weeks of street fighting suddenly found themselves engaged in a zero-range armored duel initiated from inside their own defensive perimeter.
The realization that the Americans had utilized the very foundations of the city to launch their assault was psychologically devastating, confirming that no position, regardless of its location within the built-up area, could be considered truly safe.
The final and perhaps most geographically absolute instance of tactical surprise occurred during the brutal depths of the winter, possibly during the critical phases of the Battle of the Bulge, or subsequent operations across Central Europe. This maneuver required defying not only the terrain, but the inherent physics of extreme cold, an unprecedented armored crossing of a vast frozen expanse where the risk of the thin crystalline surface collapsing under the immense weight of the tanks was absolute.
German doctrine in this area, which involved large, shallow lakes or seasonally flooded plains, relied on predictable limitations. While the ice might be thick enough for infantry, the calculation of vehicle weight versus ice tensile strength was clear. Heavy armor could only cross known, professionally surveyed routes, and even those were risky. Commanders felt confident leaving large flanks unsecured, assuming the open, frozen water bodies were better protection than a full battalion of infantry. The American column, composed of a full complement of Shermans and support vehicles, faced a choice dictated by strategic necessity. Either take a massive, exposed detour that would allow the enemy to reorganize, or cross the frozen expanse, a distance of several kilometers, in a single night. The decision was made to press forward, relying on the coldest hours of the night, when the ice would be at its maximum thickness and cohesion. The preparation involved extreme risk mitigation, the removal of all excess supplies, careful calibration of fuel levels to minimize weight, and most importantly, the strictest possible adherence to spacing.
Tanks moved not in tight formation, but separated by hundreds of yards, utilizing the wave principle to minimize the cumulative stress on the frozen surface.
The sensory reality of this gambit was one of terrifying silence punctuated by terrifying sound. The operation began under the silent, freezing starlight. The cold was acute and crystalline, the air so dry and biting it stung the exposed skin.
The movement was slow, almost painstainingly deliberate, maintaining the lowest effective speed to prevent hydrodynamic pressure waves from fracturing the ice.
The only sound, aside from the low, constant rumble of the engines, was the subtle, frightening symphony of the ice itself. Beneath the heavy treads, the ice groaned, shifted, and emitted high-pitched, resonant cracks that sounded like pistol shots in the immense silence. Every crack sent a jolt of pure fear through the crews. It signaled that the crystalline structure was failing, that the water below, black and certain, was only inches away. Drivers had to rely utterly on the intuitive judgment of the tank commanders, watching constantly for the telltale darkening of the surface that indicated thin spots or microfractures forming in the wake of the preceding vehicle. The sheer scale of the traverse ensured that the German forward observers, peering out into the vast open expanse, saw nothing but pale moonlight on a frozen, featureless plain. The American vehicles were low silhouettes, moving slowly enough that the eye dismissed them as optical illusions or shadows cast by the moon. When the column finally reached the opposing bank hours later, scraping their tracks onto solid earth, the element of total strategic surprise was achieved. They had effectively leapfrogged dozens of miles of prepared defenses. The sudden materialization of a full armored division on the flank of a confident, resting panzer division, which had relied entirely on the impassability of the frozen plain for its safety, was catastrophic. The ensuing engagement was brief and one-sided. The German counterthrust was disorganized, having been hit from the direction they deemed impossible. The psychological effect rippled throughout the German command structure. If even the absolute barriers of geography, the frozen weight of water, could be negated by tactical daring, where could true security be found?
These 5 instances, the ascent of the icy Italian crags, the churning penetration of the Hurtgen Mire, the amphibious surfacing from the French rivers, the subterranean assault through the city's underbelly, and the silent, frozen gambit of the Ardennes, collectively illustrate the profound disruptive power of American military engineering married to a determined tactical ethos.
The Wehrmacht's reliance on fixed, predictable geographic defense was decisively broken. These were not just victories of steel over flesh, but victories of ingenuity over topography, turning supposed natural barriers into avenues of sudden, overwhelming assault, leaving the defenders in stunned, demoralized realization that in this modern war, nowhere on the map was truly safe. The environment, once the defenders' staunchest ally, had become merely another obstacle to be overcome by the roar and scrape of the American tank.